Uh, Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on wherever you are. Welcome to season 2 of Dissecting Capitalism webinar series. Today, we are very excited to have Professor Shailaja Fennell. She's a professor at the University of Cambridge, and we are very excited to hear about government and grains, food grains. I would now like to request Arun to introduce our speaker. Thank you, Professor Fennell, for your time.
Thank you, Satwik.
Thank you, Satwik. So welcome, everyone. Professor Shailaja Fennell is Professor of Regional Transformation and Economic Security, Department of Land Economy at the University of Cambridge. Her research has focused on institutional reform and collective action, food production and rural development, gender norms and gender gaps in development interventions, and provision of public goods and the role of partnerships. She has led several international programs in Asia and Africa. For instance, the Tigris UKRI funded program that studied on how to improve crop productivity and water use, identify appropriate crop and farming practices for sustainable rural development in India. An ASEAN funded project that, for instance, look at where leading a core team responsible for designing the framework, commissioning experts, and compiling latest research to deliver first ASEAN development outlook that focuses on policies to ensure inclusion and sustainability in Southeast Asia. She's also a co-founder of the Forgotten Crop Society, which is established in 2021, a professional association across academia, corporates, and civil society to advance research and development for all major under-reserved and forgotten crops so that food security is achieved and livelihood is improved. And as Satvik mentioned, today she's talking on government and grains, re-examining the historical relationship between nation states and economic security. And we are really looking forward to the talk. Over to you, Shailaja.
Thank you so much, Arun, for that very kind introduction. Satwik, I'm going to try and share my screen. Okay. Thank you, everybody. What I'd like to speak about for the next 45 minutes is to provide you hopefully more than a whistle-stop tour. 45 minutes is enough for that. To give you some key thinking about recent history, so the last 2 decades, but also reflecting that in that longer arc of the 200 years of capitalism. Thank you for inviting me. I think Dissecting Capitalism, Satwik, allows both that longue durée as well as looking at the latest stage of liberalization. So I would like to share both aspects of that, if I may. Okay, so why economic security? Currently, economic security and human security are new narratives that have entered the development arena because there's recognition that merely providing, however important it is, merely providing economic goods and services does not seem to ensure a reduction in risk in the lives of individuals across nations. Not only in low-income countries, but even in high-income countries. And of course, in the context of COVID, we are particularly aware of this in ways that are worrying. So I'm just going to turn my phone off because otherwise it will beep at the wrong moment. I do apologize. So I'm going to talk a little bit about economic security as a starting point, using the UN's own recent narrative about the need to understand that individuals do not just need, as households and communities, they need more than just goods and services. They also need the ability to plan their futures and to manage their risk. And as all of us will know who have read economics at various stages, it's only in that environment that innovation and connections can flourish. The flip side of economic security, and particularly in relations, I will argue later, with food grains, is the challenge of both political instability and also the overthrow of democracy, starting with the various Arab Spring revolutions. Many of them were associated, as in the case of Egypt, with the rising price of bread. And some of you may again think historically, Marie Antoinette and let them eat cake. So there is this whole narrative of what is the relationship between the modern nation state and its ability to manage the needs of its people. And where there's a rising public discontent, as it says, be it in developed or developing countries, The loss of governmental capacity and ability to recognize government as a legitimate feature creates even further challenges in communities. And so, while I will not cover all of these, because this would be a book, I will touch on these 6 arguments, 3 from the longer durée of the 18th century, which will be recalled more than directly engaged with in this lecture. The first, the notion of the king. If you like, I'm using the 18th century as a trope for pre-colonial thinking and the relationship which colonizers had with the colonized world, particularly in the Asian context. And so the idea of kings, legitimate kings, for those of you who read economic history, the works of Pierre Tien Will or of Robin Bin Wong, the arguments made was famine always existed. The first 101 of economics is poverty and hunger, and they are the first goals of the MDG as well as the SDG. And so ensuring food supply was always the first. But as authors have argued, that this construction of moral economy is itself an 18th century construct, which does not mean kings were not concerned about their people. But the idea of this relationship is also a particular moment of knowledge making. So if we think of the 18th century as a moment of knowledge making, then authors such as Richard Grove and Tirthankar Roy argued that this is not primarily about the state controlling people, but about the state controlling the natural world. If you think about what Richard Grove calls green imperialism, going outside of Europe to look at other places, it was to control the natural world because that's where the wealth was. And I was struck very much, for those of you who attended last time's lecture, the lecture on climate change that Ghosh gave, very clearly this is a particularly significant moment to reconsider these older arcs. And the third one, of course, which is the most straightforward one, an area that I have researched considerably in the last decade again, reassertion of Malthusian considerations. Is it still this simple linear relationship of food supply with the exponential population growth story? If we take the end of the 20th century as a point, a standpoint against which to reflect, what does it say about these earlier arcs? Are they simply historical moments? Or, as I'm going to argue, are we seeing them revisiting us in the 21st century? So early on in the 20th century, with the decolonization and the rise of independent nations across Asia and then sub-Saharan Africa, it started becoming clear that food security was often narrated by the hegemonic powers of the West as a narrative that was coterminous with the rise of democracy. And we've seen a number of powerful theories, including that of Amartya Sen, that argue this. But from the point of view of Western thinkers, it was about the hegemony of the West, the fact that they, as democratic nations, particularly the United States, would provide the food security for newly independent countries. And this, in a way, becomes a precursor. You read a number of authors who've written about this, Daniel Imewar, others, the new narrative coming out of the IR school in the United States, looking at development, clearly points to agricultural modernization, the particular focus of the Green Revolution, efficiency and scale, did this in a way by undervaluing what agriculture already existed in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. So when you do knowledge making, you can also do knowledge erasure. And it's a really interesting feature. You're saying you're large countries, you are populous, and therefore we need to provide you food because you are in danger of suffering famine. Now, clearly famine existed, but this narrative, which argues that modernization is based on efficiency in the Iowa plains and moves directly from the agricultural extension services there to other countries, selecting or pre-selecting those crops for traits that were done in the global north has huge implications for the huge biodiversity loss that we have seen. So yes, the Green Revolution, without a doubt, reduced hunger. It made it possible for countries like India, Pakistan, China to increase their yields in rice and wheat. But through the imposition of a singularity in terms of crops, it actually reduces biodiversity. We have one banana, the Cavendish banana, which everybody eats. And we know there are other bananas that are outside the global value chain. The research investment, therefore, only focuses on these single crops. And then we have a collapse in the system, right? So what we end up with is an immiserization in terms of diversity while you are focusing on efficiency. And this is an unstable formulation. And it's for this reason, as later I'll talk about the forgotten crops, they haven't disappeared, they just do not get the same attention. One of the most interesting features of this, if I may just step to sub-Saharan African context for a moment, is there was a loss in the total agricultural extension services that African countries got between the 1980s and the 2000s. So most of the money went into new tech rather than extension. And this is a very poor balance. Consequently, and I'm going to talk as many other authors would have talked, by the end of the 20th century, there was an interesting moment. Countries across Asia developed. So early 20th century, mirroring the arguments that I made, China and India are the focus of many of the food security stories because they are these two huge populations that need to be fed. They themselves grow quite a lot of food, but they're regarded as areas that food security has to be established. And what is behind this hegemony of talking about the new donors providing food? It is in many ways an anti-communist philosophy. And you can see this in the now available Rockefeller papers and others, saying very clearly this is a way to control communism. So while developing countries, as they emerge as industrial players, attempt to move into middle income status, start arguing about self-sufficiency in food grain and the symbol for national independence, by the time we get to the end of the 20th century, the narrative has become that which is constructed by hegemons across the world. And the demographic argument of the Malthus Club of Rome, 1970, know the growth of population, or the political economy of who provides the technology, become the new areas for discussion and debate. What has disappeared, as I've said from the previous slide, is this moment of, is the global South not capable of feeding itself? This idea of self-sufficiency, where is that richness of diversity of food plates? That all of us know when we talk about food in India or China or Indonesia, we have regional foods, we have local foods. That whole narrative has disappeared from view. I just want to give you an example again of the declassified statistics. This is USDA 1974. I'm working on a project at the moment. Look at the title: HIV, wheat and rice in non-communist LDCs in Asia and North Africa. There's plenty more where this came from. Really, this narrative, in a way, worked against the intention of self-sufficiency as seen by independent nations. And so I come to the 21st century. Many of these arguments are writ much more intensively by the time we come to the financial crisis of 2010. What leads, both precedes and succeeds, that is also interesting. It opens up the point I was making at the outset about economic insecurity, and particularly the subset of that that deals with food insecurity. What do I mean by this? Well, if exogenous shocks are still likely to cause damage to countries, it is because they have food, but they are limited by the way the global food supply chain is constructed across countries. Post the global financial crisis, till COVID, the argument was we have returned to normal. Now, post-COVID, we don't know, and now there's Ukraine. What I want to argue in the next few slides, giving you a visual representation, is the way food insecurity is being discussed today. And I want you to reflect on those historical arguments and why this idea of returning to normal is itself vitiated by this singularity focus on one or two crops, which are bound to collapse with the next shock, whatever it be. So here is a narrative from the CGIAR in 2015. This is pre-COVID, post-financial crisis. The attempt was, we are returning to normal. What do we need for the future? Very much driven by the demand for food as a consequence of us moving towards 9 billion as a planetary population. And so they're arguing, given the trends in 2015, end of the MDGs, to get to 2050, we must increase production. Same few crops. It was rice, wheat, and maize in the 20th century. Now you're adding soybean. But again, these are few crops. Of the cereals we eat in the world today, just under 90% is rice, wheat, and maize. And soy mostly is fed to animals. That's how we don't know we eat it. of that, close to 50% is maize itself. And maize is not simply what we eat. It's in every form of sugar, dextrose that we've got, fructose. Maize is part of that global value chain. So what we've got is a huge concentration on a few crops, which therefore every time we either have a natural disease or a financial crisis will become the force for new types of shocks and inefficiencies. Let me explain this another way. The relationship between growth and development is about moving out of agriculture to be able to move into industrial production. So here, the relationship between basic food balance, what you're eating and what you can export, but that is really kind of able to buy. And you can see the dark red and the orange is in the parts of the world which actually have a lot of biodiversity, I'll show you in a moment, but don't have enough in the global value chain. There's that imbalance. Here's another way of looking at it, again, relating to what was being said by Professor Ghosh in her earlier lecture. If I represent this as the Aspen Foundation has done in terms of calculating data available in scenario building of climate change, once again, the percentage change in yields is going to be the most extreme in parts of the world that are going to be water scarce and in other ways climate affected. So you've got an overlay between the preceding one, at least for sub-Saharan Africa and South and Southeast Asia, but then even the bigger areas are going to be affected. So this leads, if you like, to a situation like Ukraine. Oh, we're in a shock. I accept that. My argument for how we move away from that will be different from the narrative that's been presented in the mainstream. So here's what calculations are happening at the moment. The FAO and others are providing data, which is very helpful. Torero, who is the leading figure in the FAO, has done calculations saying, of the countries where there is climate change, which are the ones the most vulnerable? Again, you can see a majority of the vulnerability comes out of countries that are in the global south. Why is this the case? Because the argument is there's not enough institutional capacity. My argument is institutional capacity has not been invested in these countries because there has not been an adequate look at both biodiversity, but also, very importantly, at the plates of nutrition that are consumed. And as Satwik may know, I'm going to say a little bit about millets in this regard, because a lot of the work that we've been doing recently in the Tigris project that Arun kindly mentioned is about looking at foods that are consumed. Now, millets are an interesting group, and I'll talk about them a little bit later, but I want to finish the story about food spikes and what happened. So I early started to research some of this in the 2000s. In 2008, there was a big stop press story. Global food prices are growing. Remember India and China, they're not insignificant, what I'm going to say. Food spike. The argument made at the time was India and China are middle income, they're consuming a lot of food, that's why there's a food spike. Trade economists at that time were arguing, based on this idea of trade exported and food balance, the slide I gave you a couple before, arguing food security through trade is the best. So that must mean the rice and the wheat and the maize and not the foods you consume at home that don't go overseas. What is the follow-on corollary? Wodon talked about this in 2009. He said, well, poor and near poor producers in poor countries will only have a secondary effect from these spikes because the global spike happens internationally and then feeds into poor countries, right? Like Ukraine now, high spike, it's going to affect poor countries. But Lloyd more recently argues that the biggest player in this is actually the food industry itself. So it's a endogenous variable. It's not, oh, the food industry, external spike. The food industry is the cause of the spike. And this is mainstream agricultural econ telling you this. So we need to ask the question slightly different now, particularly in the light of 2022 and what we're seeing. Do international food spikes affect the poor who do not access national and subnational markets? The answer is yes, but not directly, because it's not the per capita or GDP in the country that affects hunger. It's the distributional processes when GDP gets hit in countries. So what we get is those who are already disadvantaged get multiply disadvantaged. But this means we have to look at subnational supply chains and not just global supply chains. And a lot of the literature on supply chains only extends to the national boundary. Let me make this clear again by using a picture. Pictures are useful. So this is the classic picture that we all see today, repeated across newspapers. Look at the spike. Look at the spike. Everyone said, oh, the big spike, 2008, right? The food spike. But then financial crisis, it went up, different shocks. If this was India and China, and I'm going to argue in a minute it wasn't, but let's presume it was, then this is financial crisis. And this is post-COVID. So food spikes occur repeatedly. And of course, this is the futures market playing out a role in the global economy. But how would you overcome this? Or why do some countries overcome this better than others? And where are the systemic inequalities coming in? To do that, let me just remind you of what was said in 2008. Grain gobbling. Asia is now eating more. Middle classes in China and India are growing. If this happens, not enough food, there'll be other parts of the world that will have famine. So, India and China will make Africa hungry. For me, this is a return to what we saw in the Cook Report 46, just before independence in India, that food imports increase suffering. That if you give countries food import, they won't grow. It's because of population growth. This argument keeps repeating itself, that, somebody's eating, therefore somebody else doesn't get it. What is actually happening is we have forgotten about these other areas where there has been growth. This is the global supply of millets. Millets are not one type of plant. Any plant with small seeds is called a millet. Millet simply means small seed, millet, okay. They grow across the world. They're basically shrubby plants that grow with small seeds, and they go from temperate to tropical. They also benefit, they have a low glycemic index, so they're small, they break up in your body slowly. So you don't have sudden insulin buzz like you have when you have big polished rice and wheat. So diabetes in adults gets reduced, which is the big problem. They also are gluten-free. Basically, they are more healthy, but because they were small seed and yields and returns and calories were what the 20th century was about, they did not get any high-yielding variety treatment. Rice, wheat, and maize, all big grains. The first high-yielding variety in millets came in 1996 on the CGR system. This is an example of a forgotten crop. People didn't forget them. People ate them. Across the world that we look, from Odisha all the way to Maharashtra and Punjab, people in South Asia eat. Across the Sahel, people eat. In Southern Africa, people eat. It's been forgotten. It's not been invested in. The supply chains are not being created. Why is this important at this point about the relationship between the nation state and economic security? Because now we're at a moment where ICRISAT, the CGR system for the semi-arid tropics, has invested in 6 millets. They're getting high-yielding treatment. They're being provided so that they can be used. They're very important because millets survive in hotter climates. So with climate change, up to almost 48 degrees, we know they can grow. And if you are able to do some germplasm work, maybe up to 52, and they take much less water. So they are useful. But for the 21st century, to be able to benefit from agriculture, what we need to ensure, in a way which hasn't been done, is the accumulation of the global system in the past did not give developing countries benefits because they were decoupled. WTO decoupled. This is, if you like, taking Samir Amin's ideas back into the agricultural space. And this is really important because WTO, we still know the Doha round is not complete. And so for developing countries to be able to say, okay, why not millets in the supply chain? Well, the same arguments that would happen for others. So developed country agriculture has claimed livelihood security for itself, like the French saying, farming is a way of life. That debate which developing countries want to take into the trade space has not happened. It's really interesting because West Africa tried to do this in the early 2000s. They said, we'll drop all subsidies if Canada, which buys all our cotton, also drops all subsidies. High-income countries don't want to do that. They don't want to lose their farmer income. What this does mean is that where this link between production and merchandise that I showed in the earlier slide should happen, there's an organic link. You can grow and become accumulative within your country. That gets denied in the existing trade rounds. And so if we keep going back to, oh, trade is the way to grow and giving donor aid is only going to make people eat more and have more children, that simplistic Malthusian argument, to move away from that, it does need education in the extension service and building networks, and allowing new rural possibilities. In the areas that we've worked, in Orissa or in Telangana or in Andhra, farmers again will grow millets, but we need assured prices. Does this mean MSP? Does this mean a new supply chain? We cannot be in a scenario where once again we go down the route of this opportunity will all grow the same millet, it'll grow in the global supply chain. That's what happened with soy. Soy, that fourth crop that came in, is all about selling from Brazil to China. It's not about small soy farmers being able to make a benefit. So that driver of efficiency, this simplest notion in capitalism that you want the highest return without thinking about the portfolio management for the small farmer, is hugely problematic. And it's for that reason the poorer and the smaller have been kept out of the realm of gains from accumulation. Rural has the possibility of accumulation, but it has to be at a smaller scale. A lot of the millets factories that are processing want 10,000 farmers, or these 5,000 farmers to provide their millet supply. What farmers want is for people to come to their village and to take the millets and to do it at the cluster or block level. So, maybe, 200-300 farmers, smaller machines. These kinds of ideas of accumulation allow rural rather than to think about just a single farmer. And that's why I made that point. Economic security cannot be about income to a single farmer. It needs to think about how you have networks in the community. What would that do? Am I being, romantic? What would that do? How would it change things? Well, here's an example from the ADB itself. This is not agriculture. This is all flows. But what domestic value added is bilaterally outflowed. So what you're growing in your country that you sell. If a country can do this for manufacturing goods, which is the majority of what's happening here, why can this not be for processed agricultural goods which become manufactured, right? Effectively, if I'm selling pasta, it's a manufactured process. So if I'm growing millets, and my message has been to my colleagues, the future for India is Maggi millets, right? Healthy, easy to eat. I know it's half jocular, but the point is we've got to think about ways in which we can make these possibilities, because you've got to think about nutrition and sale and scaling up the supply chain. And when you look at it this way, it doesn't seem so ludicrous, the argument I'm making, because this is being juxtaposed with the previous argument that says, well, trade doesn't include agriculture. And I'm thinking, well, hang on. In the high income world, agriculture is increasingly industrialized and made a product. I mean, countries sell milk, they sell chocolate. These are all, industrial goods in a sense. And what we need to think about, therefore, is when you're talking about the economic security, particularly of farmers in the rural, who are still more than 50% of populations in low-income countries, we need to make the argument that economic security for producers and consumers need to be thought about in this way that unfortunately has not been the norm. So what would happen in the second part, if you like, I want to talk about what would happen if we thought about the world of the natural world in a different way. So there's all the stuff that's above board in the global supply chain and then below. And there are the things that people eat locally, which are not part of the global chain. So when we started looking at how people eat food, we said, oh, they eat millets and they eat with the greens, and then there's a lentil, it's a balanced meal, it varies across, it changes by season. That's the slow food movement in Italy. That's the high quality production in Japan. This is not so pie in the sky. This has been done in other parts of the world. And then if I bring these into the world of climate crisis, the IPCC itself said in 2020, there is a huge value in including these so-called forgotten crops, which is why we created the Forgotten Crop Society. And there are three areas that I want to talk about. And the first is, of course, the one I've already said. If you bring in additional crops, it allows us not only to improve food security, but most importantly, to protect and conserve traditional knowledge, which is what was missing in that early 20th century notion of green imperialism. You take the commodity, but you don't recognize the knowledge. You don't recognize the guardians. Then you give them a new crop and say, now grow this from scratch. What a wasteful process that is. Would it not be more effective to try and think about how knowledge production is additive? So knowledge making could add and also identify gaps. I'm not romanticizing farming. It's very hard. If there is climate change, there may not be water, there may be other changes, but working with what is, identifying the gaps for what isn't. This is true in countries across South Asia. The case of Nepal, really, really interesting. Adhikari et al.'s papers, they talked about the ability of farmers to choose local beans, barley, millets, and maize, because they knew they were more resistant to water stress and cold. My point about millets, they go across species. I have a colleague, Helen Ann Curry, who's a brilliant book called Forgotten Maize, and it's her point, everything gets held in seed vaults. Can those seed vaults be shared with communities? That's the point that's being made. More interestingly, in really vulnerable but very important areas, if we're taking Nepal, but going to the high mountainous regions in the Himalayas, then there is a huge variety of what we call horticultural crops. People don't eat large cereal base. You eat a small amount of cereal, and the small seeds, as I said, release slowly. You don't feel hungry, but the whole idea of vegetables, taro, yam, wild fruits, foraging, these are now powerful narratives in high income contexts. We talk about how important they are because you're living with nature. And so we need to move away from the idea they've been forgotten to there has been a particular mental mode of thinking about agriculture, efficiency and single plant. We need to open up the gaze, and sustainability then doesn't become something that we have to create from scratch. It is there, but it is below the radar. And we have to change how we play that out. So it's no longer in that scenario. And so as I move to kind of the second part, and just to get you to think about some of those things, what is good is that, interestingly, because of COVID itself, the concerns about food insecurity have emerged in high-income countries as well. Because when COVID happened, local supply chains had to replace the collapse in the global supply chain, right? And this is before Ukraine, and that's given us an even bigger knock on to think about why this is important. So the FAO brings out an annual report called SOFI, State of the Food Insecurity Report, and it highlights the most important one in each round. As you can imagine, 2020 was all around COVID, as was 21. But one of the things that came out of it, really interestingly, is that the concern of food security is not adequately reflecting the food security of households. This could be Britain. This could be Vietnam. There are lots of places, and this is why I asked that question. GDP and hunger are not simply correlated anymore. There's a rising hunger in high-income countries because of redistributional collapses. IFPRI in particular has been looking at new ways of doing research, which is looking for subjective measures of satisfaction. How do individuals in the household regard their food access, their food quality? Because there could be variations by gender, by age, by activity. These are very, very important. The presumption that everybody in the household is at the same level is not true. But most importantly, out of the COVID narrative, FAO and WHO are sharing data. These SOFI reports actually show you nutritional data that exist with WHO. And COVID had to bring these two people together in a way that had not been done before. So my point about governments and grain is governments now have better data, so do international agencies. And so economic security should be more feasible now using new methods of analysis and data collection. And stepping back from that new data availability needs to be this narrative, why are we conceptualizing food availability in a different way? And that is because food is not just to be measured in calorific value anymore. In fact, we want to consume less calories and smarter calories and more micronutrients. That's what the entire WHO data is showing us. Because the rise of obesity is no longer a measure of a rich country. I call it poor countries having rich country illnesses. So in a poor country, the poor are obese because they're eating polished rice and wheat, and they're less able to manage it. But every country across the world has an imbalance in terms of micronutrients versus calories. So in a way, you're saying this is a common playing field, even if we're not all on the same level. We need to work at this together, which I'm arguing in terms of both the political economy as well as an epistemology of food thinking is much better than we were there at the beginning of the 20th century. It was, oh, these are poor countries, they don't know what's right, we're going to tell. I think that is a very inaccurate starting point, and also a very fallible type of ontology that we should not fall into. So as I move forward, let me give you the challenge and the solution. This happened right in the middle of COVID, right? Everyone was really concerned, loss of food, and then in the classic, bizarrely Malthusian way, more plagues, more crisis. I mean, Malthus said, right, it's all gonna be doom and gloom. Locusts emerged, and there's this picture, you can see the locusts emerge in Arabic Peninsula. They go both ways, they come to Kenya and they move towards South Asia. Why did the first thing happen here? Because after 5 years of bad rainfall, we got a late period of acute rain. So as I said to you, these are very important. We work in Ethiopia as well, very important in terms of teff, millets, other small grains. If you have a lot of water, even a semi-arid crop will become more lush. It's getting more green leaves. Locusts don't like dry plants. They like green plants. So you get a good rainfall year, every few years, the locusts come. And of course, this is what early warning systems are all about in food production. It's not just about yield, it's about knowing how to manage the crop. And so what we got in a COVID scenario, when there was huge, controls on labor movement, we got a scenario where these creatures were flying, and once they get to bright yellow and they just spread across because they're the adult population, you can't do anything. And the only way of shifting is for countries to share knowledge. And so here's the point I was making. Global value chains, national governments. Countries are vulnerable to extreme events, of which COVID was only one, unfortunately. We do not hope to see one like COVID again, but we will have floods and droughts repeatedly. And so when we say, okay, Jack, things are normal between the financial crisis and the next COVID crisis, is a completely untrue statement. We are going to get more insecure. In fact, through COVID, we got more food insecure as a globe. And that food insecurity was problematic because it was going from one country to the other, which would pit countries against each other. And economic security can be a zero-sum game rather than a collective action success if you do that. Countries fight each other as they do in trade wars. And I've superimposed a temperature increase because we already have sources of collapse, right? We have, if we go to 4 degrees, we know there will be deaths. We know seeds will get sterile at about 52. They will not grow. In this context, to lose food supply is hugely problematic. Where does this put us? This puts us in a world where the natural world needs to be managed. We cannot have a world of green imperialism, which we are very close to, as Jyoti was talking about, in the way high-income countries are talking about the narration of climate change. And what we need to think about, and I just love Cyril Ferran's statement, it would be funny if it wasn't so serious, right? Locusts are a bit like this coronavirus. A rapid and effective response in one place can be undermined by failures elsewhere. So at the G7 meeting last year, and this is where economic security was discussed at length, high-income countries were saying, oh, economic security for the G7. My argument is economic security is a global public good. It cannot be done at a national level. It has to be done through ways of managing collectively. And so I'd like to therefore move to my final slide and thoughts, saying, at the end of the UN's report on economic security, it makes some very important points I'd like to share with you. There needs to be a new global deal. Economic security is a human right. It's a universal concern and therefore a global responsibility. I think where the G7 and the international IR literature has focused is that economic security is a national tool. In that sense, food security is a global issue. Of course, nations have the responsibility and the duty to feed their populations. But by promoting economic security, if it could be done through 2030, SDGs, these kinds of agendas at the international level, with the proviso that SDGs have that individual countries can choose their pathway, which is why the SDGs are so much better than the MDGs, we could coordinate in contradistinction to what we saw with the locusts, and moving on from one country to the other. And while I have used food security as the lens to look at today's lecture and given you a little bit about my own world of millets and why we're thinking about it, there is a policy set of values. Next year is the UN's World Year of Millets. The Indian government, India is the biggest producer of exporter of millets in the world at the moment. So there's an interest this country has in doing this, but the narrative needs to be about how we create these new commodities that can bring communities in. If it becomes yet another way of replaying the Green Revolution for another Green Revolution, I think we're going to fall into the same problems of scale and efficiency and lack of diversity. But please recognize food is not simply about calories and hunger. Food is also a form of livelihood. It's the basis of employment. Food is also about nutrition. It's a form of health. Most importantly, food is about the rural economy and the public services to that economy. So in some senses, while I've talked about food security, it's also a trope for how important understanding what food is from the local to the global needs to be in the worlds that we're in. I'm just coming up to the 45-minute mark, so I'm going to stop. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to your thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Shailaja, for your stimulating talk and also guiding us to look into food security and economic security with that particular political economy lens. So I'm sure that many young scholars waiting to ask questions. Now is the time that you can ask this. You can take one question at a time. You can raise your hands and then ask your question to Professor. Or alternately, you can also type your question.
Yeah. If nobody is asking, I can ask the warm-up question, but I will wait for 10 more seconds.
Maybe while others are thinking about the words for their question, you can start with the question.
Okay. My question is related to, of course, you have touched it. I was wondering, how do you see existing agriculture-based economy? I mean, most of my empirical experience suggests that farmers cannot really survive with whatever they're producing. For self-consumption, it's fine. But if it is to earn means of livelihood in the money-based society or monetary price-based society, it's not enough. Have you thought about it? And the role of subsidy. I mean, you indicated about subsidy when developed countries subsidize their farmers. For example, EU will subsidize something about $40 billion in the agricultural economy. But when a developing country or the least developed country will try to do that, they will be prohibited. That it's market distortion. You are distorting the market. So can you share some thoughts, please?
Really good question, Satwik, and very important time to discuss this. So I'm going to take it from both point of view. So here's an example you'd like to think about maybe. So the UK moved out of the European Union, negotiations, and when it moved out of Brexit. But on the other hand, that allowed the UK to think about what will happen post Common Agricultural Policy. So there's the new process of both a farm bill as well as an environment bill. And the argument that the government is making here is that it's not protecting crops or the price of crops, it's protecting the environment. So farmers will be given money as they were before, but earlier it was called set aside, but now it's for actively improving the environment. In fact, we just have been given a 5-year major grant to look at the landscape regeneration, and that's what we'll be engaging on. Many of things that we've learned from the Indian and African experiences of how to work with communities, we're going to try and see because farmers, as you rightly said, are farmers, and farmers across the world find it very difficult, given that they're recipients of world prices and with the ups and downs of managing this. And of course, the world is largely of smallholders. 75 to 80% of the world is smallholder farmers. And though there are very big landholders and they are the big players in the global supply chain, they don't correspond to the majority of numbers of farmers who work in the world. So absolutely, both those things are really important. Is a minimum support price like we have in India the best one to have? Can there be other ways of thinking about it, which are not crop specific or land specific? And that depends on the extent to which a particular government and set of agricultural institutions have data. So when you don't have data on land or ownership or land quality or soil quality, you tend to fall onto the commodified production, which is on the particular cereal, and that's what you look at. Which means, as consequently, while it is important to support farmers, you're not looking at the costs and the needs that they have to manage their land and their resources. Is it not therefore possible, and this debate has been long-standing in South Asia, about moving away from MSP, but then changing it to looking at costs of water, soil, has to be thought through. And don't think that the current farmer agitation, clearly showed that had not been thought through. So revisions and reforms are worth thinking about. So what have high countries done? They've used the livelihood argument, and they've used now the sustainability argument. And I'm saying SDGs should allow countries in the global south to do similar. And that's an argument that needs to be made. And it's particularly needs to be expedited because countries in the global south are hugely being affected by irreversible changes in their soil, like in Bangladesh, where if you've now got salt in your rice fields, there's absolutely nothing you can do. I mean, you have to move away from rice farming to shrimp farming. So, you just think about the huge pressures that there are on small farmers. And so we need more instruments in agriculture rather than less. And it's not simply doing away with one and bringing another in. We have to think about how you bring them in. In the UK, there's going to be a 4-year period while farmers are being consulted. And let me tell you, farmers say the same thing. People in cities have no idea what's happening. You need to come and talk to us. Our lives are hard. So this argument is a global argument of small farmers. And besides the smallholders, they're also the tenant farmers. I mean, those who rent the land out, for whom it's an even harder case. So what's the solution, you ask? We have to think of rural as more than agriculture. Agricultural processing, or what's called rural industrialization. I don't mean go back to the 1970s ideas. I'm saying when you talk about processing plants and you talk about industrialized agriculture, be it through organic methods or other methods or seed, you need to invest in local collective goods in the rural system, which will increase the value added within the sector. And then you will have increased returns. With the work we did in Maharashtra in Western India, we found our farmers, in what, everyone says Vidarbha and it's terrible, but in Ahmednagar, they'd moved from growing cereals to growing grapes, and they're using drip irrigation, and they've got drones. And they told my postdoc, who was a PhD student at that time, we earn more than you, leave your PhD and come and work with us. There are huge shifts occurring across the world, and we need to be much more aware of what's going on. So that's just a slightly positive way of looking at what you just asked.
Roy, Gobi, I can see you have raised your hands. Go ahead with your question.
Hi, Roy.
Hi, hello. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was very comprehensive as well. And I'm actually maybe turning more pessimistic, but continuing the line that you were, because I think you were talking about the majority of farmers, of course, smallholders. But one of the things I've noticed in my research, my research is a bit more specific into the digitalization of agricultural value chains, so I'm dividing basically my perspective on the effects for smallholders, and then the perspective effects for the more sort of integrated private sector, which is already linked to global value chains. And one of the things I've encountered is that, yes, I mean, in comparison with the 70s, it's not just that let's say the money or the profits, it's not just that it's more of a private sector dominated activity, human activity, but also that the directionality of innovation, strategies, agendas are more and more devised and promoted by private sector actors, very big ones as well. Also, big tech is entering agri-food, like Amazon, Microsoft. They have a lot to say about the future of agriculture. And I don't know what you think about this. If definitely there's been a replacement of sorts with maybe the retreat of more traditional modernization strategies from states, and suddenly these spaces are being occupied. And I'm talking about very small things, because I'm also seeing that, for example, in certain parts of India, now it's platforms like AgroStar and Krishi and things like that, which are, for example, expected to do extension services, extension advice. What do you think about this? Is it a cooperative thing? Is it a replacement thing? Should we be concerned? Thanks.
Good question. And of course, we should be concerned about any changes, because we want to know whether they're sustainable or not. I think the most important part is what you asked, why is the private sector coming in? The private sector is coming in because the top half of Indian agriculture is rich. Let's not forget, the farmers at the top end, I call it the grandchildren of the Green Revolution. They've done good. One of the research projects I did similarly was looking at mobile tech and young people using mobile. I mean, the states of Punjab and Tamil Nadu are just saturated with young people who want to use phones and thinking about tech. They're also looking at where's my next job, which kind of links to what Satwik's question was. So yes, Roy, there's an interest, there's a keenness. Whether there is an ability of providers, and is this a kind of, problem of a matching in economics, that, the supply and the demand in terms of the tech. So as I said, giving the example of the millet machines, I was talking to people at both IIT Madras and Bombay, who are partners in our projects, and they were like, yeah, of course, there's places, there are setups, there are startups. And then you said, someone said, in Coimbatore, you can go from Madras and they'll be doing these kinds of grinding of machines. And they were like, we do rice and wheat, but we need at least 1,000 farmers to do the millets for us to modify the machine. This is the problem. There isn't a scale issue. So then you go to a big company that says, we'll provide you the tech, we'll provide you everything. You got a Californian bot that's being built for Vietnam, which I think is slightly weird, but only because the Vietnamese didn't ask for it, but that's what you wanted. And I'm not being rude or in any way, being deriding. I'm just saying it's not a good fix for what people want. So I don't disagree with that, but the fact that we have these opportunities, the investments need to come. And so, you can talk about patient capital, the areas that we've studied where we found agricultural extension works have had 30, 40 years of investment. Bio-cooperative, which then brought in someone else. And that's a different time horizon to what the quick returns of the big companies are. So yes, there's money to be made. Yes, tech is a really good possibility. No, without regulation, it won't work. And you will get quick returns for some and you'll get losses. And that is my concern. I do not want a Green Revolution 2.0 with all the problems of the Green Revolution 1.0. Because for me, the concern is this is a more vulnerable population, both because of climate change and then semi-arid areas, but because the moment you go into communities and talk about their traditional foods, you're also disrespecting their knowledge and of what they're guardians. And that's why I worry when people say, there's a collapse, let's just have seed vaults. And you're like, no, not unless people have access to those seeds. Right? So there needs to be much more work. There need to be many more layers of intermediaries and regulation to do this in a more useful manner, which, if I can say, transactions costs for, because there's a huge asymmetry of information that exists at the moment. So yeah, there will be a future in this, and in a way, for me, that's what's positive, because it is showing that rural development is a possibility. But yes, I share many of your concerns, and I think most particularly the Brazilian soybean story, which is just such a disastrous story in terms of what it's done to the environment. And also, why is feeding soybean to pigs the most effective way of growing pigs? I don't get it. Why should the entire soybean market be used? Because it's path dependency. It's been done, it works, so it continues to be done. Doesn't make sense. There's nothing that says that, pigs prefer to eat soybean to something else. Illogical. Does that answer your question, Roy, or begin to answer your question?
Yes, thank you. Thanks so much. That's very interesting.
I see that Elena, you have raised your hand. And go ahead with your question.
Yes, thanks a lot for the lecture. I love your argument that a lot of foods have not been forgotten, but they've been pushed aside. which I completely agree with. I was wondering more from an almost practical point of view of what policies do you need? How do you avoid scenarios like the booming of quinoa or the booming of avocado worldwide, and then the overexploitation and all the appropriation and the ecological harm? If you have any thoughts on that.
Great question, Elena. So I always start my millet stories when I'm talking to local radio students is I don't want another quinoa story. The quinoa story is one of the most painful small grain stories that we've had in the recent decades. To take a small grain grown in a shrub with poor communities, to change them from local producers to bringing them into the global value chain to the point that we're getting $300 a month to then collapse again, with the big farmers then using quinoa to grow, which was irrigated. So you get super quinoa, which has none of the taste, is exactly the story of unsustainable agriculture. So yeah, we don't need we don't need the term superfoods being used in a way that destroys livelihoods. I think my argument there was, are you happy eating something that is destroying someone's livelihood? It doesn't make you healthier, or doesn't make you feel better. Maybe it makes you healthier. And actually, it's not making you healthier. We know the moment you grow grain with large amount of water, it increases the sugar value. So the health value is falling. We really need to think about eating in season, eating locally, trying to understand why we need to consume more food. The same thing with avocados. I mean, with all of these stories, great avocado in terms of good cholesterol, fantastic, but we've got to think about how it works and why it works. And I think one of the problems really is that we haven't as yet started thinking about the blueprint, as in the water blueprint of food, or we're thinking at the moment of carbon miles, but not thinking further. Sustainability of food systems cannot be understood if we look at single commodities. And then somebody asked me, but you're making my life very hard. I just want to go to the supermarket on Saturday morning. And I said, well, eat local. Don't eat quinoa, eat oats if you're in Scotland. There are other things that will do the same thing for you. And that is important. Why are you eating something? You want certain things out of it. And if that's what you're thinking, then we as consumers can make choices, need to make choices. Otherwise, we're going to get into this situation, which we've seen in the UK, that the poor are increasing in levels of obesity compared to the average population, because the foods that are the cheapest are the ones that have been over-processed and are just calorific based without anything else. So there's both a distributional challenge as well a global distributional challenge. And I've got serious problems with the quinoa story has made very clear to us. So that's the first part. Why do we do these things? Because it's easier to signal a single plant, a single value, and then that becomes scalable, everybody grows it. I think what needs to be done is to say there's a difference between, okay, so when you eat an avocado, it's a Hass avocado. There are lots of avocados in the global biodiversity mix. Why do we just have the Hass avocado? Which is why I pointed about the Cavendish banana. As someone who's Tamil myself, for me, bananas are a whole world. And if I was an Andean, potatoes are the whole world. Why do we not look? And I know Julia's on this, she'd probably be able to say a lot more. The diversity of food cultures is what makes food important. That's why I signal the slow food movement. There's something very valuable in understanding what food means in our lives. And unless we bring that into the system, I don't think we're going to solve the problem. So I don't have an answer, Elena, but it's a really good question. I hope that was useful.
Yeah, as a demographer myself, when I read this reports from Eat, Lancet Commission, etc., which is very narrowly specifies food diversity, and the idea is to have healthy food from sustainable food systems, but it narrowly focuses on certain crops and how they are healthy. And I mean, I myself studied in some part of my life at Bangalore and Chennai, and millets and the local food system and the nutrients is never covered in such reports. I see that Mihika, you have typed your questions.
Sorry, let me just read Mihika's question. Thank you.
No, but you can ask your question if you can unmute, Mihika.
Right, please, Mihika, go ahead. It's a big question, so do unpick it. Is she not there?
Okay, you can read her question and maybe I can also read it for you.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. She's there, but somehow.
Oh, mic is not working.
Okay.
That's all right, Mihika. We will presume you're reading it. Please, Arun. Yes.
So thank you so much for this thing. Does I have two questions. First, grain production are not just about food consumption, but a large proportion does towards energy needs, and the energy or food complex will keep the demand of grains high. Does this coupling pose particular challenges to your analysis? And the second question is, your point about subnational distribution change for food security, especially in India, is really illuminating. To what extent is that true for countries in the north, like in the UK?
Great point. So I'll start with the first one, Mika. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done to unpack that further. Absolutely. So the biofuel moment was very acute just before the spike, and their argument was that part of the food spike was because of this futures market that, you know, food cereals, particularly at that time sorghum, of the small cereals, it was small sorghum that was being used because it had a particularly high sugar content for thinking about biofuels. Fortunately, with other green energies coming along, that seems to have taken a slightly a step sideways, and that I think is a good thing. In some ways, I think there's a false trade-off that is being done between food for production and food for energy. I say this because oils can be more useful as nutrition than when you think about biofuels. If you think about why you need an energy sector, right? You're saying we're thinking about different ways in which we can generate. Food waste is probably a better way to generate energy than biofuels, right? Why would you want to grow more food that can be used to eat rather than using the high level of biofuels which can turn into biogas? So again, every tech idea doesn't necessarily have to be the best idea. Tech ideas are great, but they need to be ascertained whether they are effective in a particular area or not. And that's why I said tongue in cheek, I got nothing wrong with the Californian bot, but in labor using countries, it may not be necessary to have a bot. Maybe it's necessary elsewhere. And maybe when it's 52 degrees and nobody wants to go out and water, you can have clever drip irrigation, and that's great. That doesn't mean you don't have to have people. So this idea of either or acute trade-offs, I think often are falsehoods, and we need to think about more systems-based analysis. If I can use Eleanor Ostrom, whose work I find extremely useful, both in institutional design, as well as in thinking of socioeconomic systems and socio-ecological systems, we need to intertwine the various components, parts of what is a complex system. And simplification of complex systems to create Pareto optimality is an economist's headache, and it's not how the real world works. I can see why you want to do that, but it doesn't always work. So yes, I think the decoupling does become important. And I think in an Samir Amian sense, what Amin would say would be precisely this: why are you producing this? What's it for? Right? So if the idea of biofuels is, does your country need to use this? Or is some other country using your land? That in a sense is the land cost. Right? So you're going to use it to produce food, or you're going to use it to produce something else, or you're going to do a set aside for environmental reasons. And again, as Jayati said last time, is really interesting. Why do poor countries have to have the responsibility of all this for high-income countries? You know, it's not as of the global value chain, you can come and use this. And that's my point about not putting land and water pricing into the system and just putting the carbon credits in and saying, well, you can grow this for us, you can do this for us. This is not an equal relationship. And it reminds me of the hegemonic relationship in the early 50s. We'll give you food because we want global democracy. I'm sorry, it doesn't work like that. If you're talking about negotiation, countries have to sit and debate and discuss what's necessary. The other point that you said, which is really interesting, to what extent subnational distribution changed. So COVID really brought this out. I wrote a piece and around it about local chains. You know, everyone said, oh, countries have done well in COVID. In Germany, look at Germany. The country that did the best in terms of food security was Vietnam. They used the local radio stations in local languages, and they said, stay home, eat. Women, please breastfeed. Do not give formula. We will deliver the following things. The primary health workers went and delivered vegetables to every home so that informal sector workers didn't have to come out, compared to, say, Indonesia, where it wasn't so good. And I'm not, comparing countries to name and shame, just to say that the idea of local food systems exists. State of Maharashtra in India, again, the farmers couldn't deliver. They took food around to neighboring villages where they knew there was hunger because the food was lying there. It's not as if local moral economies don't work in situations of crisis when people know their neighbors. The point being made is there isn't, however, an institutionalization of the value of subnational distribution chains. And that is because the global supermarket has become such a powerful player, which is why I used Lloyd 2015 to say that the food industry itself drives certain incentive structures. And so a country that is better at local is Italy, slow food movement, Scandinavia, the foraging movement. These are things that we know. And I'm not being romantic saying go back to the past. There was hunger and famine in the past. I am not advocating that. I'm saying think about what local systems do. Think about the value it gives people's lives. Think about the moments where this was bizarre. I mean, some of you may not have been doing research at that time and don't think you will, but the whole thing about jasmine rice and basmati rice, Rice Tech company in Texas was trying to get the IP for it. Sometime later, a company in the UK was saying, oh, we want to have the IP for turmeric. This doesn't make sense. There are values in these products because they're grown in particular ways and eaten in particular ways. To extract them and make tablets, of course you can, but these are natural systems. Most importantly, they work because they're intercropped. A lot of the horticulture works because it's covered by silviculture, by plants, by larger plants. And that's why you cover and create a local environment where the temperature is lower and they can be grown even in the summer months. We were discussing this in our research group. If the temperature rises to 46 in India, will people grow the kharif crop or not? You know, if the rain gets postponed. We've got to think about plants in that particular way. So yes, decoupling, but the coupling and decoupling occurs because the logic of efficiency is monoculture. And unfortunately, that creates a monoculture in thinking, and that's hugely problematic.
Any other questions?
Yes, there is one. Shatish Kumar has written here. Shatish, would you like to ask the question? It's quite. Yeah, if you please.
So thank you,
Hi,
ma'am, for
Satish.
your. Hello, ma'am. Thank you for your insightful
Please.
lecture. You talked about food as a source of nutrition or livelihood. So how should we balance out nutritional security through agriculture diversification or agriculture development, or institutional induced nutritional support in the form of PDS or fortified rice? So nowadays, government is emphasizing more on fortification than taking, rather than emphasizing diversification or emphasizing more on dietary diversity. So how do you see these changes when it comes to political economy of food, where government emphasizes more on efforts which can benefit lobbies or rather than the small farmers, as we know that 86% farmers in India are small and marginal, and they are directly dependent upon their own production. So how should we see that? Thank you.
Such a good question, Satish. Thank you very much. So fortification of consumption goods has been established through the 20th century. I'll give you one that was a very good example and compare it with the current discussion, which is more problematic. So early on in the 20th century, salt in India and across South Asia was given an iodine fortification. Simply, very simple. Iodine was introduced into salt. It was simply a process of crystallization with iodine. It was nothing more than that. It wasn't a genetic modification, but we consume salt. And that was because goiter was a major problem. Thyroid deficiency was a major problem across India. And since all Indians eat salt, it was made available. Okay, that's good. No doubt about it. You want to get rid of what is clearly a health problem, right? And it affects human cognition and brain development. Iodine deficiencies are hugely problematic. Now, at the moment, the fortification argument is being made because people cannot get nutrition of certain sorts. That's the way the story is being presented. However, if you have a diet of vegetables and other micronutrient-based foods, it could also be a way of absorbing. The question I would argue, Satish, as you put it, is why are we not at the same time measuring what the knowledge base of communities is? So when we were doing our contigress, we asked this question. There is a particular seed called amaranth. It's called Rajdana in Punjab. And it's a tiny little seed, and it is consumed by many communities across India as part of their diet. it has a huge number of superfood values. And it's very important in terms of iron and blood supply and other things that are there. So the point that is being made is that we are not clearly identifying where communities have a lack of knowledge and where they may benefit. What we are applying is a template approach. Give everybody fortified rice and that's going to solve the problem. Doesn't make sense. Suppose I'm a community that doesn't eat rice, right? Suppose I'm a wheat eating community. What's that going to do for me? Is there any thought? And so what we've got here is what I would call is off the cuff solutions because you want to get rid of a problem. Nutrition in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa is a huge problem. And it's an even greater problem for particular groups. So infants, particularly moving from breastfeeding to moving to alternative foods. There's a loss that they have in weight and in health. Lactating mothers, these are important groups to think about, right? And then we know the whole story in India about midday meals and the challenges about what can be eaten and what can't be eaten and what government says. I don't think here in these cases it is crystal clear that the intentionality of any of these reforms is actually thinking about long-term nutritional gain. It's to get a quick win. And you don't get quick wins that will solve health problems. And that is my concern. So with millets, we had this, this huge heart searching. Suppose people eat millets with sugar, because a lot of places where millet is eaten as sweet. But then we're saying you don't want the glycemic index to go up, but then everyone's going to get diabetes. So the whole Odisha Millets Mission, that's a really good example. The huge movement was to create savory dishes. That's why I said millet Maggie tongue in cheek. But the idea was, can we think about other dishes that people will eat? And so the Odisha Millets Mission has now been invited in neighboring states of Chhattisgarh as well as in Jharkhand. And when we were part of Tigris, which only finished on 31st of March, we had conversations in Punjab. Would they be willing to think about this? We need to get the delivery. So the bureaucratic apparatus needs to think about these. So far from just saying one fortified product is going to solve it, because that returns to this idea of it's a single point solution. And while iodized salt was that, I don't think fortified rice is that. So I think it's a type 2 error. We are doing something that's inappropriate in terms of thinking about it.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Of course,
Go ahead.
please.
Yeah. So, ma'am, it just came out from your answer and you have tried to explain. So, ma'am, when we talk about millet, and you are emphasizing so much on millets, that millets is a way in which we can ensure nutrition to our population. But a question come up in my mind. I just been to fieldwork in Ahmednagar, and I have realized that people are slowly or gradually realizing the importance of millet, and people in the urban areas is calling them so-called superfood and all, and there is a demand for that. So one of the aspects I found that there is a local people are not realizing the importance of millet, although other people are realizing. And the first thing. The second thing is, once the local people have started realizing that there is demand of millet, how should we ensure that they grow it sustainably, and the error or mistake we have done when we went for the first green revolution shouldn't be repeated when we started emphasizing the growth or the development of millets. So how should we negate those errors which we have done in the past when it comes to millet development or millet production development?
Good, very, very good question, Sadish. So I don't think millets are going to be a foolproof solution. I think it's an opportunity because there's a wide range of millets, even beyond the 6 millets that ICRISAT is using in different states in India, different millets. So it could be bajra somewhere, ragi somewhere, others. So samai, tinnai, there are so many in Tamil Nadu that I can think of, eaten at different times for different purposes. So again, I think that somebody asked a question about local solutions. So I would strongly recognize the value of state and below state initiatives. Because something has worked in Orissa does not mean the same will work elsewhere. In fact, one of the things we were doing yesterday in the research group was mapping precisely this. In Western India, in Gujarat and Maharashtra, people will eat millets mostly as dry chapati, right? It's eaten more as the bakri, or whereas in Kerala, we were saying that, it's of course water abundant, but there they cook it with milk. and have it as a sweet. Whereas in Karnataka or in Tamil Nadu, it's eaten in upma or other forms. In Maharashtra, it's eaten differently. In Punjab, it's eaten as a bread, right? It's a roti. It's a very different kind of thing. So if I think just about the variation across India, it is eaten in different forms. But also, what is it eaten with? I want to move away from this idea that the plate is carbs and then something else. If you look at the typical ways it's eaten, you have a small amount of millet. Remember, you only need a small amount to fill your stomach. You have greens. The biggest part of the South Asian and, in fact, the sub-Saharan African diet, where I've looked at millets also, is largely with greens. And that's what gives you that iron fix, right? And the millet has to be processed and roasted because otherwise it doesn't allow absorption of iron. So I'm not against fortified millet. So one of the things that Ikrisat is saying is growing a fortified millet with fortification of iron. Sure, but only if people find it tasty. Then what else does that work with? It works with herbs, which are micronutrients. So we need to then create a plate so that people say, I want to eat this kind of meal, right? And not some other kind of meal. So in fact, I've been having conversations, saying, why not the snack companies in India? Why don't we have a murmura or other version? And in Ikrisat, people are talking of extrusions. They're thinking about this in, other ways. You want a healthy snack. Pounding of millet is a really slow process. We don't want to return to more labor demanding processes. We want to think about how this works. And I'm only using millet as a signifier for the fact there is a much more diverse plate of foods that are associated often with a wedding or an event or something else. So bring that back in so communities feel that it's valuable. And that goes back, Satish, to the other part of the question you asked. Why don't poor communities want to eat millets? For at least 100 years, millets have been associated with names given, again, from global classification processes that are associated with poverty. Even dals, lentils, pigeon pea, cow pea. Why would you want to eat something when you're regarded as poor? In fact, when we started this research 7-8 years ago, when we were writing the bids, I remember my students from East Africa said, you would never ask someone if they eat millets because it's synonymous with saying you're poor. In fact, if somebody told you in the village they're eating millet, you would bring food to them because it's considered a poverty crop. So there is this incredible hierarchization of things that are healthy, which are regarded as poor. And so aspirationally, people are going to move away from them. And unless we, as local methods of consumption and social aspiration, are able to change this, then we are going to have this problem. In fact, we have this problem in the Gambia. They grow millets for sale and eat polished rice. It is a classic example of this same problem. So I don't disagree. I'm not saying I have a solution. I'm saying there is an opening here for thinking differently. And as you said, so we don't return to the Green Revolution problem of getting calories, but creating new problems in the nutritional space.
Rok, you have a question type there. You want to ask the question?
Yeah, I can also ask the question. Hello.
Hi, Rok.
I must excuse myself. I wasn't at the beginning of the lecture, but what I've heard is very interesting and very positive. I live in a countryside in Europe, in Slovenia. And my biggest question is, no matter where I look, I also have a little background of food industry and preparing food. And for me, I think that the food in the cities, because I think that the biggest problems are the cities and people are in the cities who don't have connection with real land, because life is always connected with the land. And if you don't give back, and because I see as a city concept as is today, it's more a parasitic way of how they are making economy to the land. And I think that the prices of food should be raised in the cities, especially because they are the ones who produce all the pollutions by all the packaging that is needed for them to have it in the cities, all this food. And at the end, I think, I don't know what is the current situation, but I know there is like 1/3 or even more food that is produced and brought to the cities is thrown away. So logistics here plays a lot of important role, and I know that there is one guy who previously asked about logistics and digitalization of. I think that a lot of IT people should go and live in the rural area because internet is everywhere. So that is the first thing that they should do, and then they decide what they should build. Thank you.
A great question, Rock. No, I agree with you. In fact, what was really interesting is young people are happy to return to rural areas if they think that they're being valued. We did a small project in Rwanda where we talked to graduates, because graduates go agricultural, economics, and then there's no job. And we said, would you like to be sustainability data collectors? We'll give you we applied for some grants. We worked with our colleagues in the University of Rwanda, and we created on an iPad for them to, collect information on what sustainability indicators the villagers would find useful. But the first thing they had to do is introduce themselves to the villagers, and they said, why are you doing this? And you've got a degree. And they said, well, because it's important, and we've got an iPad, and we want to communicate, want to come together. And they felt, because they didn't have a job, this was something, they got a certification saying they'd done this. But as a team, they grew in confidence, and they grew, an understanding that this was important. And it really is. And I call this bottom-up sustainability indicators. And I think rural is a place to think about this, be it in terms of food or in terms of the natural world itself, in terms of the water or the soil, trying to bring these together. And whenever I talk to tech people, as you do, Rock, I find you get a bunch of young engineers and they say, oh, we're going to create a platform. The first ones are going to do this. And then you think, I like that sales pitch, but are you the first ones? Has someone else done that? Why didn't it work? And it's in no way knocking, great. You need to have this kind of, attempts and, day-long workshop, but really just think about what worked and why it didn't work. And sometimes I say learning from failure is not pathologizing. It's actually thinking through why you might want to redesign something. Hence my point about Eleanor Ostrom's, institution design. We need to design things because we need to understand what was not designed before, or maybe it couldn't work. So I think, Rock, you make a good point. Going into a community, working with them, trying to understand what's necessary. And in terms of your very specific point in the chat, I think it is crucial. Why is food wasted? It has to do with logistics supply, right? Most of us know, if you have traveled through rural areas, particularly in South Asia in the hot months, food will be on the side of the road. There'll be crops, there'll be commodities piled up, and sometimes there's only that shelf life. So when you think about what methods you have to increase the shelf life, sometimes you come up with very innovative methods. So again, when we were in Rwanda, people had come up with a much cheaper version of a fridge. And we've seen versions of this. Somebody said they worked in Ahmednagar. Satish said people would put onions in those wonderful onion cages, and they can live up to 4 months in the temperatures in Ahmednagar. And we found the same thing in Rwanda. They were growing chilies for a commercial enterprise from Kenya. So they're beginning the idea of exporting. But they never eaten chilies. So it's quite interesting. They said, you're from India, will you taste the chilies for us? And they said, we can't eat chilies. We've never eaten them. That was by the by. But they had learned that if you used a black plastic material and created a so-called refrigeration chamber, without refrigeration, the chilies would last up to 2 months. So, it was a way of creating, with insulation, the idea of a chamber without actually having a fridge. And this was something that came up because somebody had a tech idea and they worked with it. So again, the point that earlier was being made by Roy, do we need to have the Amazons? No, and they won't want to come in because they're looking at least $1,000 per unit, not $22 per unit. So when we think about other solutions, it's trying to work with communities, which doesn't mean that they don't want drones when they get to a level where they have the investment to do it, but to try and build these so there isn't waste, particularly when you're commercializing, because you're putting in your money. The other side of the question, and this is really interesting, when I think it started where Satwik asked me, but farmers are small. When you're putting all your money in your investment for your commercial crop, you're really worried about other things. And that's why I was making the point about portfolio and risk, because this is what's happened. You look at, if you put aside all the things, why BT Cotton, the big companies, the biggest risk to the small farmers, I buy the investment. Am I going to survive? And so to do that, we've really got to think about what are the fallbacks they have. And for that, they can't be tied into contract farming without thinking about the consequences for them. So I think, Rock, you're making some really interesting points. If we can think about the rural and the agricultural space as a new space for innovation, which is my early point, then you're understanding both what is and is not possible. You're also saying it's fine to step away from agriculture. If agriculture is only default, People should not be in farming because they have nothing else to do. But they may still wish to live in rural because moving to the city is difficult. So it has to be opportunities available for people if we're really thinking about reducing transactions costs. So that would be my answer, Rock.
Yeah, I just want to add something. I think I read the question. I felt like, Rock, please excuse me for this kind of intervention. So I had a feeling that he was also asking our habit of wasting food.
Yes, sorry, that bit I didn't answer. Yes, you're absolutely right. Thank you, Satwik. There was a third part to the question. I was responding to his comment rather than his question. I agree. So now going to your question, Rock. Why does food get thrown away in cities? I like the way you put it really pithily and thoughtfully in terms of lack of respect.
Because maybe I could explain, because if I go to a supermarket each evening, they throw away bread.
Yeah.
They throw away bread, they throw away vegetables that are on the deadline or something like that. But that doesn't mean, that food, even if somebody would come there, it would be kind of labeled as poor people and getting for. And I think that is something that we should change, the culture of thinking that we should buy food that is at the end of the deadline first, to reverse that kind of mindset culturally, not on all levels. You first pick up the ripe fruits from the apple, not the green ones. And the same should be done in supermarkets or, in the city. So you first have to sell the food that is near the deadline, and then should be the other foods. I think it's just a mindset shift. And I think
it's a really good point, Rock. If I may, I would think that the reason is because we're only looking at what is a perfect commodity. If we can have a Cavendish banana, which has to have a particular curve, otherwise it gets thrown away, there is no sense. So there's a whole movement called wonky vegetable movement, where supermarkets now in the UK will sell their local vegetables, even though they're wonky. And that's a massive shift. It wasn't there 20 years ago. In fact, many people in the COVID, because supermarkets didn't have vegetables, started sourcing from local farmers. In my community, company said, what's it like in the UK? We were buying eggs locally. Somebody would come around because that person was previously having eggs being produced for restaurants in the local area. And of course, it all closed down. And we all bought eggs from that individual and they delivered. And we all kind of helped each other. And so this was my point, that communities are not without the ability, but when you scale it up and impersonalize it, and we think about food as less than 10% of our budget, which never happened in history before, I think that devaluation of food is crazy. It also allows us not enough time to think why we're eating something, why we want to do it. This whole idea of our relationship with our natural environment and what we're consuming is very, very inadequately measured and thought through. And in a sense, if I just tongue in cheek say, that's why we spend so much on the other things, the leisure or the exercise, because we're not thinking about, there has to be a balance in how we live as a species and how we live as individuals. And I agree. I mean, some of the changes are really interesting. So local shops which produce food will give food away to shelters rather than throw away food. And that's a shift. That's a big shift. Those are the kind of things, but it is sad that we had to have COVID for people to understand that the role of food banks in high-income countries. However, with that wake-up call, maybe it's time to think about, malnutrition is a global issue. There are concerns in every country, and we need to think about this. And if anyone tells you that's not the case, then they're lying. Sorry, that is the truth.
Thank you, Professor. Now we are actually touching towards the end of the time that we have scheduled for. Maybe I'll move to Satvik for final words. And, from my side, thanks a lot, Professor, and for everybody else who was here. Over to you, Satvik, for the final words, and then to close.
The final words are very small, and I'm grateful for your time. Thank you. Thank you, participants. Your participation matters, and the questions that we have discussed, some of them might sound radical, but maybe without answering them, we'd be all doomed. I don't want to be pessimistic, but if we don't act quickly, climate change and many other problems of the world will destroy us surely if we do not act. Thank you, Shailaja, for your time. We'd all like you to join us if you can during our next session in a week, where when Katharina Pista would be talking about how laws are manipulated to help build the capitalist society that we know, how capital as a thing is constructed and controlled by some people, a group or community or institutions. So if you have time, please join us. And thank you, Shailaja, again for your time. And with this, we will formally end this session. You are welcome to stay with us for a few more minutes if you want. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Satvik. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you all for your great questions and your participation.